In example 4, we're going to graph y equals 2 cosine of 3/4 x plus pi over 2. So notice we are changing the amplitude, we're changing the period, and we're actually shifting it this time. What we're going to do, just like before, is whatever's inside the parentheses of your sine or your cosine graph, that's where your key points are going to be filled in. So we're going to fill this in first. So these are our key points. So those are the same key points we always use: 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And then we evaluate them, just the regular cosine function. So if we evaluate cosine of 0, we would get 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of pi is -1. Cosine of, let's make that look a little nicer. So this is -1. 3 pi over 2 would be 0, and 2 pi would be 1. This you're going to fill out for every graph, this middle part. Then what we need to do is figure out what x values we want to use for our actual graph. And to find these x values, you're taking whatever's in the parentheses and setting it equal to each of those 5 key points. So we'll start with that 3/4 x plus pi over 2 and set it equal to 0. First thing we would do is subtract pi over 2 from both sides. Doing that, we get 3/4 x equal to -pi over 2. And then we need to multiply by the reciprocal, so we'll be multiplying by 4/3 on both sides. And we get x equal to -2 pi over 3. And that's our first x value, -2 pi over 3. Then we take this 3/4 x plus pi over 2 and set it equal to pi over 2, our next key point. So now we take 3/4 x plus pi over 2 and set it equal to pi over 2. If I subtract pi over 2 from both sides, pi over 2 minus pi over 2 would give me 0. So I get 3/4 x equal to 0. And then whether I divide or I multiply by the reciprocal, 0 divided by anything is going to give me 0. So I get x here equal to 0. Then I'm going to go ahead and take that 3/4 x plus pi over 2 and set it equal to pi. When I do that, I'm going to start by, again, subtracting the pi over 2 from both sides. When I do that, I get 3/4 x equal to pi minus pi over 2. And I need common denominators here to subtract. So I can change pi in terms of halves, which would change this to 2 pi over 2. So essentially that tells me that 3/4 x is equal to pi over 2. And then I need to multiply by the reciprocal, so I'm going to be multiplying by 4/3 on both sides. And that gives me an answer of x equal to 2 pi over 3. And I can fill that in here. My next thing to do is take that 3/4 x plus pi over 2 and set it equal to 3 pi over 2. Well, if I take 3 pi over 2 and subtract pi over 2, I get 2 pi over 2. And 2 pi over 2 is the same thing as just pi. So I get 3/4 x equal to pi. And then I multiply by that reciprocal. I multiply both sides by 4/3, and I get x is equal to 4 pi over 3. And then finally, if we can find some room over here, I'm going to take that 3/4 x plus pi over 2 and set it equal to 2 pi. So if I take 2 pi and I subtract pi over 2, just like before, I'm going to need common denominators. So getting those common denominators, real quick, I can show you 2 pi minus pi over 2. We would want to change this 2 pi we'd have to multiply at the top and the bottom by 2. So that's going to become 4 pi over 2 minus pi over 2, which would give us 3 pi over 2. So I get 3/4 x equal to 3 pi over 2. And then finally I would multiply by that reciprocal, which is 4/3. These 3's would cancel. This would make it a 2, and this would be gone, so I end up with just 2 pi. And then finally, I have to take care of that amplitude that's in front, which means I'm going to multiply all my y values by 2. 1 times 2 is 2. 2 times 0 is 0. 2 times -1 is -2. 2 times 0 gives me 0. And then finally, 2 times 1 gives me 2. And remember, the points that I'm using to graph are always the ones on the outside, here and here. When you plot your scale, you need to make sure that you are going up by the same amount each time. So I need to make sure that's working, and if I look, that's going to be the case. So I'm starting actually in the negative direction. I have negative 2 pi over 3. Then 0, here's 2 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, and 2 pi. And then my amplitude is going between -2 and +2. So on my y-axis, I know I need to go at least up to 2 and down to -2. So I have my first point, which is -2 pi over 3 and 2. I have the point 0, 0, the point 2 pi over 3, -2, 4 pi over 3, 0, and 2 pi, 2. And I'm going to curve it. Remember, that graph is going to continue to go on forever. If you have questions on this, let me know.